All right, I am back once again with my friend. It's been quite a long time. David Chaim Smith, thank you very much for joining me today. We have a sort of a presentation or maybe like a dialectic that you and I are going to work out today. And we're calling it Revisioning Kabbalah. So thanks for being here. And please why don't you explain a little bit what your vision and your motivation behind getting this information out?
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you as well, Ike Baker. Always a pleasure. And what I'd like to do is present the view with which I engage the Kabbalistic symbol system, which is a highly unusual one. People will think it's quite radical once I start talking about it, and the assumption will be that it's this tremendous departure from everything that they know. And that very well might be true. However, the points that I'm making are actually extremely traditional. And when it comes down to it, I don't think even the most conservative and traditional Kabbalists would disagree with the main points, with the axioms from which it is built. So it's not that much of a departure as one might think. Radical, yes, because of the language and the way that I present it. And maybe some of the points are quite radical. But the emphasis, I feel, is present in the heart of Hasidus and technical Kabbalah and the various schools that interpret it on the Jewish side. However, on the Hermetic side,
Mm.
certain assumptions are made that simplify this system, and I hope nobody gets offended that I refer to it as a simplification. And some conclusions are deeply held by Hermetic Kabbalists that I think should be questioned. And part of what I do is a probe for that questioning. And there's a couple of big topics that Hermetic Kabbalists generally don't touch that we should go over. The most important of which is the issue of essentiality. And what I mean by that will become clear. That's the first one. The second one is the pretext for the entire field of Kabbalah and the use of the Sefirot. And that's called the Tzimtzum. It's a huge issue in technical Kabbalah, but occultists, Hermetic Kabbalists, very often don't even touch it. They very often don't even know about it. They've heard the term and they have a generalized understanding of it, but it serves as the basis for how the Sefirot function. So we got to talk about that a little bit. Then we'll talk about the Sefirot themselves and ways to interpret them that are really quite different than the usual one. Then I'm going to show a bunch of models, including some rather important and obscure aspects of the system that people have probably not seen before. And during that conversation, ask me anything, challenge me on anything, and just keep it loose and go for it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into this with you. I think this is a really important perspective with massive practical ramifications, which I know a lot of people that are listening are, practitioner based. So this will be certainly challenging, but ultimately, if what we're trying to get at here is the truth and the heart of the practice, I think that what you have to present here is absolutely essential. So, on that tack, maybe we should begin with essentiality, and I believe we wanted to begin with the Or Ein Sof.
Right. Upper left-hand part of the image that you see on the screen, I have the word Or Ein Sof in Hebrew, and right under that, I have a statement about the way that I approach it. I don't want to assume, but I will anyway. I assume that most of your audience views the Or Ein Sof as something above the Sefirot that's just like a giant bank account that we draw from. And in the drawing forth of that potency into the functions of the Sefirot, the 10 Sefirot, most of the audience will probably view it as a step-down process, a reductionistic process that draws down that potency in increments.
Mm.
Now, those increments posit both an upward and a downward reductionism, meaning they come down in stages and then we realize them and go up in stages. And that's not necessarily wrong. It's just a conventional view that doesn't differ from ordinary human habituation. There is an alternative, which is to view that essentiality as totally endemic to all phenomena, meaning that not only is the Or Ein Sof all pervasive, but it's all pervasive in its display, meaning if it's viewed purely as a wholeness, it pervades all of the Sefirot without departing from them in a reductionistic manner, meaning that we can delete our step-down incremental understanding, meaning delete what we call the Hishtalshelus, or the chain of succession, the chain of worlds and souls and Sefirot, if you're using a single tree model. And what you get is a kind of pantheism. However, from the view with which I approach it, it's pantheism, but without the theism. So it is a wholeness that expresses itself as all qualities, including Malkut, the Malkut that everybody thinks is this byproduct of the end of the chain. What I'm suggesting is that you view that display as Ein Sof itself in its mode of presentation, which is infinite variation, and not as a step-down byproduct at all. So these two models, the linear one, which is reductionistic, that conforms to ordinary conceptuality, and this highly mystical one, these two views are really very different. And I'm going to show you historical pretexts for how this issue of the two ways of interpreting the Sefirot has been handled in Kabbalah, but nobody talks about it. So let's start out with essentiality. Here I'm calling it a possibilizing nothingness. Now, what I mean by that is that it's possibilizing because it's an expansive open possibility. It can do or be anything. But in itself, it's beyond both existence and non-existence. It's beyond contrasts. I think everyone will agree with me pretty much on that as an explanation. The reason I'm using the term, so that explains the possibilizing part, but it's called a nothingness because it is beyond thingness. Thingness is the reduction of that potency to a specific construct or object or presentation or something that can be designated conceptually. If you can designate something conceptually, it's a thing. All right? So this transcends things. So this essentiality of the Or Ein Sof is the essence of reality. Most people think of reality as what they can observe or calculate or speculate about, and that's real to them. But from the mystical perspective, the ultimate reality is the transcendent, is the absolute. So the only way that reality becomes real to people is by interpretation. So what I'm suggesting is a different interpretation of reality. So by that token, what we're saying is this essentiality is a possibilizing nothingness, but it becomes everything. It becomes everything. And if you hold the view that I do, it becomes everything without ever leaving itself. And the whole emanationist step-down logic is a way to try to reconcile this possibilizing nothingness, leaving itself in increments and reducing itself in increments. Does it ever truly leave itself? Well, that's the big question. I'm saying it doesn't. I'm saying Ein Sof is a wholeness and is absolute even in the most direct physical encounter we have with our daily lives and our thoughts and our feelings and what we perceive as the physical objects around us. So that's the essentiality that I'm talking about here. So before I go on to the Tzimtzum, which uses that essentiality and sets it up to be interpreted, please ask me something about it, because this view of essentiality has to be crystal clear before the rest of it makes sense.
Right. So I think the main thing that like the first question for particularly for capital Q Kabbalistic or Hermetic Kabbalists of the modern variety, they're used to, we're talking about Kabbalah here, and there's no, Kircherian tree of life, and that's what they've got kind of ingrained into their head,
Right.
and you're talking about how this verticality is an analogy that has been sort of concretized and taken as sort of the fact of the matter. When in reality, that verticality, like you're saying, from Kether to Malkut, is actually almost a simultaneity. I think that one of the hardest or the most challenging things is going to be for people to reorient their understanding. We're beings in space and time,
Think
and
so?
well, I mean that's the way we experience things, and or that's the way
Maybe.
we've been habituated to interpret our experience in that way and on a massive scale. And so this kind of idea of verticality is intimating what is it communicating proximity? What's the purpose of having Keter, Malkut, and all the Sefirot in between them, so to speak? What's the purpose of that diagrammatic image if it's all this kind of, as you're saying, this essential oneness that operates as an essentiality? How do we wrap our minds around that?
Well, the beauty of it is that what you just described, that linear, sequential presentation, is how the essentiality presents itself. I'm not denying that that's the way it's presented.
Mm.
I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. What I'm saying is there's an alternate view of that presentation without changing the presentation at all. I'm using the same tree model that everybody else is, and I'm not suggesting that you change it, but what I'm posing is an alternative to the conventional logic that is applied to it. That's the radical step, and both are available.
Mm.
There are two, I mean, we're generalizing here. There are two basic general views that people can adapt if they choose to. One is coinciding with conventional ordinary habit patterns, conventional logic, and that's sequential and linear and conforms to linearized, conceptualized time and space, which is why I balk at the idea that we're beings in time and space. We just perceive it that way.
Mhm.
Yes, that's available to us. We could default to the ordinary habit field, but we could also cultivate a mystical view that breaks through that and does something wildly more profound than that. You also mentioned Kircher
Mhm.
and the Kircher tree. Now, one tendency in Hermetic Qabalah that has to be addressed is this bizarre superimposition of what I always thought was the Christian Trinity on essentiality that breaks it down into or, would base it down to Ein Sof, or,
Mhm.
right? Those three stages. What that's doing to me when I see that in Kabbalistic books by whoever, what I'm seeing is not only an attempt to make the Christian Trinity inherent in essentiality, but to make the emanationism inherent
Mm.
in the essentiality from the outset. Meaning, if they don't do that to the essence, they're not going to be able to do it to the rest of the Sefirot. That step down emanationist logic. I've never seen that in technical Kabbalah from the Jewish side.
Mm.
Not like that. I only see that in post-Kircher works that come after Kircher and Pico and the rest of the crowd.
Mhm.
I think that I don't want to say it's a mistake, but it indicates a certain view that I think should be challenged. Also, by the same token, I think this doctrine of an abyss between the three supernal Sefirot and the lower seven Sefirot should be challenged. But we'll get to that in another image where I really express it more vividly. Before.
One of the things though that I kind of want to bring up for people that are sort of theurgy adjacent or theurgic in practice, because I probably, if I had to guess, I'd say a fair percentage of the people that listen to me regularly are at least interested in theurgy. This idea of emanation obviously comes through, it also comes through Platonism or
Right.
Neoplatonism. The only thing is that in the doctrine of Plotinus's emanations, there's a what we call a sympatheia, where it's not necessarily sequential, but it's simultaneous.
Right.
These emanations. Now, you brought up something very interesting, because speaking on the tack of this sort of quote unquote Christian Kabbalah, I think the first thing that's going to come to people's minds, especially if they've worked with this magically, are the hierarchies of pseudo Dionysus, which
Mhm.
in themselves imply this kind of verticality and this proximity, right? That's the way at least people who practice theurgic magic utilize them. But you had something interesting to say about pseudo Dionysus, and pointing out the fact that really his was an apophaticism. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what we're talking about here almost, is this he negates everything that he puts forward, I think, in like the one of the first things that he says. I mean, can you remind me of that of
Yeah.
yeah.
Basically, what you're talking about is resolved when you look at Pseudo Dionysus and you look at his mystical theology, right? Because the works of Pseudo Dionysus are put together usually in a single volume. You have the celestial hierarchies and the mystical theology. Mystical theology is totally apophatic. Celestial hierarchies are cataphatic, right? They're not mutually exclusive. It's a matter of interpretation. Like I said before, it's a matter of how you interpret what is presented, and what is presented in the form of a chain, of a ladder. I'm not
Mhm.
denying that that is the case. There are certainly levels that appear more or less subtle,
Mhm.
depending on one's proximity to the core view. And the core view is expressed in his mystical theology, and it is, as he says, a denial of all beings, right? A denial of separate entities in contrast with each other, or separate levels in contrast with each other. You can hold that view and approach the hierarchy, which appears to be separate things in an order, right? With
Mhm.
the idea that it's a paradox. It's a paradox that it is open and whole at the same time that it appears fragmented and seemingly closed. It appears finite, but yet it's infinite in nature. It appears immanent, but yet it's transcendent,
Mhm.
right? It appears in a broken, shattered form. And our job as practitioners is to realize the wholeness in what appears broken, right? It appears imperfect, and our job is to restore the perfection. It doesn't mean that we're denying the appearance of the broken imperfection that presents itself. Sure, that we're not going to stop that. That's like, you know, trying to stop the ocean, you know. It's like it's impossible. So what we have to do is change the interpretation. It's all interpretation.
Okay. Well, I think that's really important to have said and to have established, and sort of challenged from those two viewpoints. One from the this kind of vertical analogy, proximity analogy. Point out how that's being translated, because we have this habituated conceptuality that's sort of trained along one track of interpretation, and then also go and look at the person who ostensibly gave us these systems of hierarchies that we use, at least in modern sort of magic, a la Golden Dawn and things, and Agrippa and things like that, and
Hmm.
show that there's actually evidence there that he's, we're interpreting him wrong, which is really important. But I know that we wanted to talk also about the Tzimtzum.
Yes,
Is
very
that now
important.
now that does that come from Chaim Vital and his work? Where does that originate in the Kabbalah?
No, the origin of the Tzimtzum comes from the Zohar, and it's amplified and explained by Isaac Luria, called the Ari. He's just called the Ari, but it's Rabbi Isaac Luria. And then in the commentaries on Isaac Luria, mostly by Chaim Vital, who was his main student, but
Mhm.
by all the successive later developments, it was brought out in great detail. But all of that detail of the later Kabbalistic commentaries are really inherent in the Zohar text if you read it right in a sort of condensed form. So it's pure Zohar. However, Zohar, being a 13th century text, I don't think is where the Tzimtzum doctrine originated. I see evidence of it in the earlier schools, but it wasn't stated outright. I think it's always been there. I think it's implied most of the time, but it's brought out in the Zohar predominantly as its main source. Now, what is it for people who don't know? I could reduce it to a very, very simple account. It's a story given a narrative of a space for creation to take place. And it goes like this: a point appeared in the heart of the Or Ein Sof. From that point, the light of the Or Ein Sof contracted back to the sides in the form of a circle. In the contraction, and the word Tzimtzum means contraction, it's as if the Or Ein Sof departed from itself or displaced itself in this circular form, pulling back to the sides, leaving what's called a halal hapanui, a vacated space. And that vacated space around that center point, and your Masonic friends will certainly understand that the primordial basis of reality here is the point within the circle, right? Going back to Pike and all the other adaptations of this. As the contraction pulled the Or Ein Sof back from that center point to the sides, we have a contrast here between a center point and a periphery of the circle.
Mhm.
So this opening created what Rebbe Nachman of Breslov calls a place for creation, a place for the worlds, a place for the five worlds,
Mhm.
right? So within that place, we have to start the creative process. And the way that that is described is the drawing down of the light that surrounds the periphery in a single line that unfolds layer upon layer upon layer, where all the worlds and the Sefirot that constitute them are formed in their interaction. Now, before we describe, and that light, the drawing down of the light into this space for creation, into the vacated space, that line of light is called the Kav, right?
Mhm.
Which draws down the creative power, right? And then out of the potency drawn from the Kav, all the details of the worlds and the beings that inhabit them unfold. And that can be looked at in a simplified manner, that can be looked at in a very complex technical manner. But before we get to any of that, we have to do some major work with what this means.
Mhm.
What does it mean to displace wholeness? Because if you could do that, it's not whole anymore. So, in a sense, what we have here is a denial of, even by the most exoteric standards, the definition of their creative potency, their God, which is
Mhm.
that it's all powerful and complete and whole and absolute. How do you displace that? And if you even could displace that, which is an impossibility from the outset, it poses a paradox. But even if you could displace that wholeness, what would that actually imply about that space? What would it imply about the absence of Or Ein Sof. How could you have an absence of Or Ein Sof? It wouldn't be Or Ein Sof then. And really what you're doing by setting up this model is treating it like a physical substance. So
Right.
it's pretty obvious that when people do that, treat this displacement of the Tzimtzum in the way that you would describe the manipulation of a physical substance, when you do that, you're defaulting to the conceptual habits again, right? So most, I don't want to say all, but most serious Kabbalists take this literally. Ooh, meaning that there was a Tzimtzum point of contraction that equals the beginning of creation. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Well, if you take that literally, it's a beginning point in time, and what you have here is a proto-history.
Right.
And what I'm saying is, fuck no, it's not a proto-history. It's a model. It's a symbol of the manner in which we deal with phenomena. So I'm coming from the side of saying that Tzimtzum never happened. And if you
Mhm.
think it happened, you are the most exoteric, rigid, religious literalist that there can possibly be.
I agree. I agree with you, man. It's, I think it's really important for people, digesting this information for the first time to, or maybe really, you know, maybe they've come across your work before, as many people have. I mean, I rarely go any place in the world where people haven't, aren't selling your books and know who you are in our communities. But to really sit and digest this means that you have to really look at your own basic assumptions and really think about, like, yeah, what is esotericism? Have we concretized it at a sort of a form that truly isn't esoteric? Are we making the esoteric exoteric? Or is that what we're doing habitually? We're pulling it out, because a lot of people cannot wrap their minds around the idea of what I think, some might call a symbolic truth, or symbolic realities, that a lot of these images, right? We commerce in images and symbols, and that's what they're trying to communicate. Not, this is very also, I would say what we're talking about right now is very Parmenidean. This whole being and non-being. How does the one become the many? Is there really such a thing as change? Does anything change really? Or,
Mm.
I mean, these were questions that he was, asking, and were never even really fully resolved in something like the Platonic dialogues. But I think that yeah, this is the kind of several further steps inward towards the understanding of this stuff right here. I think that's really important.
Okay, well, if remember what I said before is that really there's two ways to go about interpreting these symbols. One is to default to conceptual habits, the ordinary view, conventional view, and the other is a purely mystical view. Well, if you hold a conventional view of the Tzimtzum scenario, what you have essentially is the Big Bang.
Yeah.
That's really what it is. If you don't do that, then you face a very different interpretation of this symbol that has to do with transparency. Because what the Tzimtzum is doing, and let me say this, the Tzimtzum is necessary. It's necessary for both exoteric and esoteric interpretations. If you are positing an exoteric view, the role of the Tzimtzum is to separate God from creation,
Mhm.
pure and simple in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But if you don't do that, then that peripheral line that separates the infinite from the space that will become the finite, that peripheral line becomes transparent. And you start to understand the paradox that that which is infinite presents itself as the finite, but we are not fooled by it. Okay? If you hold that view, that transparency is brought through every sphere of every world on every level of the soul, and we bear it out by living.
Mm.
And that's mysticism, Mr. Ike Baker. So when we look at pseudo-Dionysus and the apophatic view, what we're really talking about here is a view of that transparency, which holds the possibilizing nothingness as your flesh and the ground upon which you stand and the thoughts in your head and the feelings in your body. It is directly imminent that the transcendent expresses itself. Now, if we don't do that, and we go back to that proto-Big Bang model, then we'll have to concede that there is somewhat of a separation between the creator and the creation, and between the immanent and the transcendent. And we overcome that separation incrementally. You see how the two views can exist simultaneously, because at any point you could revert back to your habits and view the Sefirotic in that conventional way and still be esoteric. Because when you're using the Sefirotic, you're esoteric already, right? But like you said, you will have an exoteric mindset about your esoteric work. Years ago, a great theorist from the system of Vajrayana named Chogyam Trungpa wrote a book called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And what he viewed as spiritual materialism very often dealt with esoteric topics, meaning you could have your exoteric spiritual materialism and still be engaged in the most complex esoteric intricacies. But you really haven't changed anything. You really haven't challenged anything. And we challenge our reality on the level of what I call view, how we view reality. Right?
Absolutely.
You know, Donald Trump, make America great again. What I'm saying is make Ein Sof great again.
Make Ein Sof imminent again.
Yeah. I mean, but and so what does this do? This gets into an area of, to what degree do we reify the absolute? And you're talking about Neoplatonism and the Kabbalistic symbol system. Well, we don't have Kabbalah without Neoplatonism.
Right.
Although the Jews want to say that, they're responsible for everything. No. There's so much Hellenistic thought in Judaism and in Kabbalah that you can't even separate the two. So Hermetic Qabalah comes out of a basic acknowledgement of that, and it's correct. It's correct historically, and I could even show you. The real question for me is that vacated space, that when the Or Ein Sof contracted back, opening up the halal upon you, what does that actually mean? Well, it means that there's this principle of constriction that has to be negotiated. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because that constriction is responsible for all the reductionism in our minds, that we constrict our sense of identity and the identification of whatever we perceive in a constricted manner. The question is, what do we do with that, right? Do we take that constriction that appears to us right now, all around us and within us, right? Do we take that constriction at face value and have a superficial view of what it appears to be doing, which is the default setting, in which case we would live in a fragmented, shattered world? Or do we invite that transparency into the apparent fragmentation and change our interpretation of what seems to be happening? That allows the Tzimtzum to be a symbol of that transparency. The exotericists, the religionists, want to turn the Tzimtzum into a wall between creator and creation. I want to turn it into a doorway and a window, right? That is enacted through each sphera. So what does it do when you pose this question? Well, when you contract the light out of the space of the Tzimtzum, you're setting up a discussion of what is present and what is absent. If you believe that there is something that can be present, and then the removal of it makes it absent, you've just defined conventional conceptuality pretty well. Conventional conceptuality works on contrast. It's dualistic by nature. So the default setting of the interpretation of the Tzimtzum in the usual way is a recipe for conceptuality. And the question is, how dualistically conceptual are all our other thoughts and feelings? Right? So the real question is not being and non-being, but passing beyond both of them and making both categories irrelevant. And that's what an understanding of essentiality really does. The understanding of the essential lifeblood of the Or Ein Sof is that it's neither present nor absent. It is neither a supreme state of being or a non-being. It is not a negative, limitless light. How could it be? Because that posits that there's such a thing as a positive and a negative. What I'm saying is going beyond that, going beyond the contrast, the designation of presence and absence is and is not. Going beyond that is the key. And it's the key in dealing with our Malkut, that if we apply that view to our Malkut, then Keter changes, you know, because for most people, Keter is a barrier to Ein Sof. And what I'm saying is quite the opposite.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you've talked about, your non-theist view and this thing that I think you very aptly have called the sacred lie. It's and, so that I mean that probably I don't know if you want to wait to bear that out or you talk about it now, but I think that that's another conceptual thing that is standing in the way.
Right. If you reify the absolute, you got a creator God, right? And the mythology can be taken either literally or esoterically literally.
Mhm.
If you believe that there's a creator God, which is basically the uncontainable infinite potency beyond the periphery of the Tzimtzum, then you believe that there's an immanent finite containment within the Tzimtzum, and that's called a creation. So if you take this literally, you believe in a creator out there and a creation in here. And then they're bridged with the Kav and the drawing down of the force of the creator, meaning the creative force itself, in
Mhm.
increments. And then you have an emanationist system that makes sense to you. But if you don't go for the most baseline level of logic that is implied there, you could look at essentiality in a new way. And what I like to say is that there is no creator and no creation. Because if you posit either one, you reify it.
Mm.
So to really understand God, I think you have to deny God.
That's controversial. Apokoros right there.
Yeah, well, it depends where you say it. Because I've been in a situation like the people who trained me in Hasidus and in that type of Kabbalah were Hasidim. And if you talk like that around them, you can piss some people off. But if I explain myself properly using the proper Kabbalistic logic, they'll agree with me. Because
Mhm.
actually what I'm saying is the most traditional. Excuse me, I have to, and keep this in. I'm going to take my heart pill here.
You want me to
So I
get
don't die while I'm talking to you. And it's funny
in?
because my heart pill, I take a pill called Eliquis. So, for the sake of this conversation, I'll consider myself Eliquis Levy.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to die while I'm talking to you.
Look who's leaving.
Yeah, so this whole thing about non-theism is not atheism,
Right.
right? Atheism is just a reaction to theism. What I'm saying is going beyond the whole dilemma of whether God does or does not exist. That's irrelevant to me. I'm interested in an essentiality. I'm not interested in religious mythology, either affirming it or denying it.
Mm.
So you can have your religious mythology, but if you do, there's a creator and a creation. I'm saying that that structure is irrelevant, and we could deal with the Or Ein Sof as the fundamental essentiality of reality itself. It is the real. And if you put a label on it that creates this dualistic structure, you're doomed to bear the brunt of the mythology as those before you have. And we know what problems that causes.
Yeah, I mean, then you get wrapped into this whole idea, even outside of, the typical religious, monotheistic sort of debates and debacles, even when you get into something like Platonism and that leads to Gnosticism, you can't even they can't even figure out inside the system if the creator God's good or evil, because
Right.
a lot of people think that the Gnostics were the ones to posit this sort of ignorant or malicious creator God, but really it was the Middle Platonists that started changing the idea of what was a benevolent, creator God. The demiurge started looking around and saying, well, stuff here has to eat other stuff to survive. So this guy, he might not be great, but it's a trap. It's a steep slope because you're constantly anthropomorphizing and it's
Hmm.
like, I'd like to say to people like you need a level of epistemological humility because there's no way that you in your persona in this habituated sort of way of conceiving time and space, what makes you think that you know what is good to an infinite, and to the totality of infinitude? You just there's no way for a human being to really know that in their rational mind, I don't think. So, how do you explain to us how you kind of, what are the practicalities of getting
Oh,
getting
very,
around
very,
that?
very good question. What you're talking about is really the question of reification. Because if we reify the absolute into a God, either for good or for evil, to explain our dualistic contrasts and their logic, you'd think that that's an issue of atheism or theism. But honestly, this is not a monotheistic issue at all. Because if we're talking about reification and the level of reification that you employ when you deal with these symbols and when you deal with reality itself, you could do the same thing with a pantheon of polytheistic gods as well.
Mhm.
If you reify the absolute, it doesn't matter whether you're reifying a monad or whether you're reifying a pantheon. It doesn't make any difference at all. Reification is reification. And that's what I'm really calling into question here, the
Mhm.
reification, right? The making of mental constructs that create solid objects for us to engage as subject perceivers. That's where the fundamental dualistic split is. The Tzimtzum only exists between the subject and its objects. The
Mhm.
Tzimtzum is a model of constriction. The question is, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
Right? So there are other details within the Kalala Panui, such as what I have listed on the screen here, the reshimu, the residue of the light after it has been extracted. And that becomes incredibly important because the light is extracted, but there's a residue of it, a memory of it within the vacated space. And that's where the hidden sparks within the five worlds come from, Kabbalistically. They come from that Rishimu memory, the residual memory of what preceded the Tzimtzum act. That's how the narrative works. So you could say that the residue that is left after the light of Ein Sof is extracted produces something that is there, but it's not there. It's there because the residual presence of perfection lingers throughout the appearance of imperfection.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you can't say that it's there because the light was extracted. And if we're going to take it, with the spirit with which it was intended, the extraction is complete. So here is something that is in the twilight between being there and not there. It's in the twilight between presence and absence, actually. And what the
Mhm.
Kabbalists are telling us is here's a model that seems very rigid and dualistic and black and white. The light was extracted from the vacated space. But, well, maybe not. And it's in that, well, maybe not, that the practitioner lives because the practitioner finds the hidden sparks of that perfection within a seemingly imperfect world. And that those sparks are our spiritual breakthroughs,
Mhm.
right? There's a whole body of literature about the sparks throughout the five worlds that people can seek out. When you reify essentiality, you don't view it with the spirit with which it was intended. So you can't deal with the Or Ein Sof in a very direct mystical way if the habits of reification are fucking it up for you. There's a term for this. It's referred to as the Hayuli. The Hayuli is the reification of the essence. So the conceptual model that people default to, it's just based on reifying the essence. So like I said, it's a question of reification, and you could apply that to a monad, a monotheistic system, pantheistic system. You could apply it to a pagan system with a pantheon of gods. Doesn't matter. Reification's reification. And I'll tell you, that's what the atheists are doing, and that's what the religionists are doing. So the great common denominator between those who affirm and deny God is they're both reifying something.
Yeah. Yeah, and do I have it correct? I don't know, maybe my Greco file is showing, but the Hyuli that you've got here, it looks a lot like the Greek term highly
Yes,
for
it's derived from,
matter.
yeah, it's the Heilig matter. Yeah. It's derived from that. One time with a group of Hasidim, we were sitting around studying in Borough Park, Brooklyn, 25 years ago, and they were talking about the Hayuli in the works of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, and I said, you know, that's a Greek word. Well, they were horrified. These guys with long beards. And then one of them over in the corner were like, he's right. Because it's clearly, you know, from the Greek influence of what I believe are Greco-Egyptian influence in
Absolutely.
Kabbalah that we see, like, you know, in the city of Alexandria, for example, you know, and that's when Kabbalah as we know it was actually formed in its current language. So there's more than one Greek word in Kabbalah. There's a
Yeah.
bunch of them, but that's a big one for sure. But the question is, what does it mean? Well, we're talking about reification. So let's advance to the next image.